Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, different Riveros, Dr. E. Efrain. Today we will discussing the microbiome, the impact of the Western diet and its role in metabolic disease. We have the privilege of having Inge Lindseth. He is a researcher from the House of Health in Oslo, Norway. Welcome, Dr. Lindseth.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be at your podcast, and I really love your initiative. I should say straight off the bat that I'm not a doctor, but I work as a clinician and I write papers. I am involved in research, but for the time being, I'm mostly working as a clinician and seeing patients with lots of different afflictions. And I'm also I've delved much more into aging research than the topic we're going to discuss about today. So I hope that I can still say something of value about your topic today.
That's excellent. We really appreciate your insights and your input here. So we are going to be discussing a paper that was published in the journal Nutrients in 2018. The title of the paper is The Western Diet Microbiome-Host Interaction and Its Role in Metabolic Disease. So the first thing I want to start discussing is this concept of Western diet. So the Western diet involves necessarily ultra-processed foods. So let's start talking about that. What is the definition, or what is a processed and an ultra-processed food to start with?
Well, I guess we could start with the whole initiative behind that definition or that group of foods, which is the NOVA classification, where you essentially have 4 groups or categories. And one of these groups is the ultra-processed group. So you also have another group called processed foods. So there is a difference between processed foods and ultra-processed foods. So there isn't necessarily anything wrong with processing, but it is the category ultra-processed foods that is of importance, at least to me, and also to how these foods affect our health. So ultra-processed foods has quite a long definition, but I don't know if it makes sense to go into all the details of that definition here, but one essential thing is that these are foods that you will have a hard time making in your own kitchen. So these are industrial foods. Typically, and it's not just about what they contain and how it's processed; it's also the intent behind the products themselves. Is it designed to increase consumption, to make it hyper palatable? That's also something that pertains to this definition. So, you can have, if you have a lot of additives, if you have maltodextrin, if you have flavor enhancers, if you have emulsifiers, and it's packaged in plastic, it's typically an ultra-processed food.
Yeah, and you mentioned something very important here, and is that the intent is to improve or to increase its palatability, and that flavor has, entices consumers somehow. And it's interesting to see how there has been a parallel increase in the introduction of these ultra-processed foods and the amount of people affected by obesity and metabolic syndrome, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the connection between the two aspects?
Sure. In the paper that you refer to, that is the basis for our discussion here today, is we are asking some questions there. And this was 5 years ago now, or maybe more, 6 years. So we're asking a lot of questions and pointing to possible mechanisms for what's happening. And and just to be, to make some clear statements or some actual findings, we know that food structure and processing will affect the microbiome. We know that food processing and food structure will affect your health and obesity. Just by changing the structure of the food, you can induce obesity in mice, for instance. So this shouldn't be a surprise to researcher or anyone working with food and health. Now, so why does this happen, and what are the mechanisms at play? So a few things that we know is that if you inject LPS, which are products from bacteria, into research animals, then they will get obese. So if too much of bacterial products enter into the bloodstream from the gut, which is a major site for these substances to get into the bloodstream, you will see an increase in obesity. And what you also see is that these LPS molecules, they will affect the vagus nerve and thereby lead to leptin resistance. So when we're talking about obesity, it's maybe this is obvious to you and a lot of your listeners. It's if you see that the certain meal or types of food will increase consumption at a given meal, that's interesting, but it doesn't explain the whole reason for that food leading to obesity, because there are counter mechanisms that can tell the body later on that, oops, you ate too much. Now for the next meal you should eat less. So it doesn't really explain everything. We have to talk about how the brain perceives its the amount of adipose tissue or the amount of fat in adipose tissue and elsewhere. So when we know that this is a mechanism that LPS can lead to leptin resistance or a different way of signaling what is inside the adipose tissue, the amount of fat, then we have a mechanism that can explain how people can continue gaining weight over the years. And also, when you wake up in the morning, let's say you ate lots of bacon and eggs and like a whole lot of energy the day before, that doesn't necessarily lead to you wanting to eat as much as you did the day before, because you have increased the amount of fat in your adipose tissue. And when you eat whole foods, it appears, then the body will recognize this in the way it should, and will tell your brain that today we don't need that much food, and you will eat less the next day. So I think that these issues, it's been said over and over again. It's been repeated, like, okay, this leads to overeating and therefore you will get obese. But what happens at the singular meal is not sufficient to explain the whole cascade of things that are happening. And so what was one more thing that I wanted to say, but I kind of forgot now, which is I don't know if you have some questions.
Yeah, we are going to get to the different aspects that you mentioned here, and definitely the hypothesis, and actually this has been confirmed by other researchers, is that the microbiome is at the very center of the interaction between the foods that we consume and the metabolic health and the responses to that food. So let's focus a little bit more on the food before we touch on the microbiome. And there's one aspect that I really loved about your paper, and is the way you present the fact that the whole foods that we consume come in the form of cells, with just a few exceptions like milk or honey. But for the most part, what we consume is cells. And can we start the explanation from that point, please?
Yes. So let's say you have an apple, you pick an apple and you chew that, you will destroy some of the cells in the apple because the apple contains thousands or even more cells. And within these cells, you find most of the sugars that are in an apple. So, and then as you swallow this apple, it will be digested even further. But still, when you get to the small intestine, to the duodenum, there's still going to be some pretty huge bits of clumped together cells, and that the cells are going to be, still containing the fruit or the sugars are going to be within the cells. And as you go along this small intestine, more of these sugars will be released from the cells. And this is not really that well mapped out how this process actually happens with whole foods through the small intestine. But we do know that a fair share of the sugars within, vegetables or fruits, that they will not be released from these cells before reaching the colon. So contrast this with drinking apple juice. You put all the contents of an apple and you turn it into apple juice with all the fibers and everything. Now, for you as a human being, you will know that, okay, I can eat an apple, I can drink apple juice. There's energy in both of these things, and if I'm really hungry or want some sugar, both of them will work. But to a microbe, which doesn't have eyes or can't hear anything, and they can just feel what's around them, what's closest to directly touching their cell wall. They can also get information from other bacteria that signal to them what the environment is like. But so if you have apple juice and it gets down to the duodenum and further down the small intestine, the bacteria are going to be surrounded by sugar. It's going to be sugar everywhere. But if you have bits of whole apple, it's going to be less interesting. It's going to be a lot of fiber, and the sugar is more hidden for the microbes. And what we also know is that if you have increased nutrient density or perceived increased nutrient density for the microbes, they will increase their virulence. So they will turn on genes that are more, can be more detrimental to the human physiology. And these bacteria, they use virulence factors to increase the territory, to grow, to expand, and so our hypothesis goes that this will irritate the body, and maybe be a bit quick. This could lead to inflammation and increased LPS in the bloodstream, and then one effect could be obesity, and obesity is something which can not be good by itself, but it's also a marker of metabolic derangements and something that increases the risk of several diseases such as cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So
these acellular components that, as you mentioned, say the apple juice as an example, so that sugar is started to being consumed directly by some bacteria, and the virulence of some factors is going to increase. But what happens with the fiber? If it comes with fiber, how does the bacteria use it?
Now, so there's how should I say this? Confusion, or not? It hasn't been pinpointed, or it hasn't been defined well enough when you do microbiota research. Are we talking about the small intestinal microbiome? Are we talking about the oral microbiome? We're talking about the large intestinal microbiome. So in the small intestine, you will have much less microbes than in the colon. But there are some microbes there, and when you reach the ileum, the more distant parts of the small intestine, there are more microbes. So there's quite little microbes to digest the fibers and open the cells in the first parts of the small intestine. So we don't have own enzymes that can degrade these fibers. So we need some help from them. But again, if the amount of microbes and if the food that they get is too large in the small intestine, that is something that could lead to problems for the host. So, but again, it's not really well mapped out exactly what happens to the fibers and the breakdown of these cells in the small intestine. If that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Would it be fair to say then that if you consume carbohydrates like attached to fiber, there is less availability of carbohydrates to the bacteria, but also to the host, right? So the total amount that you can absorb is must be also less, right?
Yeah. So I alluded to a bit earlier. Let's say you eat a raw carrot, and people have experienced this, I guess, themselves. They maybe looked in the toilet and see that there are things that have not been digested. There are whole parts of the carrot that are still haven't been broken down, and but there is more. I mean, in the colon, the food sits there for quite a while, usually, and there are much more bacteria there. So, and they degrade fiber. So there will be more glucose or monosaccharides from fruits that are released from the cells in the colon.
Excellent. So let's focus now on the food additives. So when I go to the supermarket and I read the nutritional label for the different foods, I see that there are multiple ingredients. It's not only if it's say apple juice, you would expect to see only apple extract or whatever, but you start seeing a list of things that list doesn't sound natural at all. So what food additives can be relevant in this case in terms of health effects?
Well, that's a good question because it's clear that not all additives are equal and they in terms of how they can affect health and the microbiome. So you have emulsifiers. That's one important group that appear to or that have been shown to have deleterious effect in the gut. And then you have also sweeteners and maltodextrin as well. So I've been looking at mostly at emulsifiers, but I've been starting to look more at maltodextrin as well. That maltodextrin, there are long chains of glucose, and starch is also a long chain of glucose. So, but there's a different structure to maltodextrin than starches, and this appears also to be yet another factor that can affect the microbiome. But the emulsifiers is what we mention the most, I think, or put the most emphasis on in the paper that we wrote. And there's a researcher that is called, I don't know how to pronounce it, but he's called Chassagne in France. I think he's working, and he's been doing the fair share of the research on these emulsifiers and how that affects the microbiome and health. So and it's also shown that these emulsifiers can increase the virulence of the microbes.
Yeah, I see that then there are several things in the food additives that are going to trigger that response. My next question is what can we do to try to restore this dysbiosis, if you will, because you mentioned that there are several changes that occur to the microbiome. Can we restore it somehow?
Well, that's a big topic, and maybe to some extent we can't, or we should at least make sure that that when we eat such not too diverse diet, there could be microbes that go extinct. And there's a project that I can't remember the exact name of the project, but that they're trying to save the human microbiome because there are certain microbes that thrive on certain foods, and we don't eat those foods anymore, then that they can go extinct. Now, when in terms of the deleterious effects of ultra-processed foods and bad behavior by the microbiome because of that, if you add more polyphenols or phytochemicals as a larger group to a meal where there's also ultra-processed foods, then that could ameliorate the negative effects of of a meal that is not of that good a quality. So that's one simple thing that one can do. If you ate an ultra processed meal, and then you remember that you have some berries or something in the freezer, and you want that as dessert, well, good idea. That could actually repair some of the ill effects of that meal. But there's lots of things. I mean, there could be time restricted eating. Could be also be an alternative, that the body and the microbiome gets enough time to recuperate after the insult, one could say, from the meal that you just ate. But there isn't a lot of clinical studies on this, but from my experience as a clinician, people who just change the time or the extend the fasting window during the night, that could solve problems for a lot, and that their stomach and intestine, that it functions much better, and also affects weight. But and I believe that can be related to the microbiome. That if the microbiome constantly gets access to lots of food and the wrong foods, as soon as the small intestine has been almost emptied from the food from the previous meal, and then you have another meal coming along, and you constantly during the day you eat all the time, or have, let's say, 5, 6, 10 meals a day, maybe the fast during the night, and there are also, of course, people who are eating during the night as well, getting up and eating, then there's less time to run the cleanup processes, so to say, in the small intestine, to really get the remnants of food and microbes to push them toward the colon. And I don't know how many clinicians or researchers who think about the migrating motor complex, which is a cleanup process during the meals, but it doesn't really go that, or it's not really that operative if you don't have breaks from foods at times.
Yeah, that's true. And also it maintains a balance between the fed state and the fasting state in terms of hormonal balances. And I think it's a great message. And you mentioned that the inflammation happens, there is more virulence from part of the microbiota that we have. So once that inflammation happens, how is that inflammation related to metabolic disease?
Well, as I alluded to maybe a bit earlier, I have not been staying as abreast of the science, as I shouldn't have really pondered these things as much as any researchers within this field would have. But again, it's inflammation is something that is a hallmark of every or almost every chronic disease. It could be also a bystander, but as we talked about, chronic inflammation is not good. It is that will lead to disease, will lead to problems. And as far as I see things now, one important thing could be this leptin resistance or decreased leptin signaling from the gut, from the blood to via the vagus nerve to the brain, and not informing the body or the brain correctly about the status of the adipose tissue.
Excellent. And one of the central aspects of your paper is that you propose that the guidelines and the dietary recommendations start taking into account different aspects other than just the amount of macronutrients or just mentioning the food additives, but the concept of the microbiome should be included somehow. What is the proposal?
Well, it's clear that the microbiome is affecting us, and that the diet is affecting the microbiome. So I feel that it should be more discussed. At the same time, though, I think that the mechanisms that are actually involved here, they need to be elucidated more. And so what I'm mostly concerned about, or what I would like to see as a first step, is an acknowledgement, clear acknowledgement that macronutrients foodstuffs, that cannot explain, everything that has to do with diet and health. Food structure, food processing has something to say for how the body works, and I don't think that is acknowledged by far enough in official dietary guidelines. So it is as if that it doesn't really exist, even that food structure is something that affects us, and processing and additives in general. And I it's just overwhelming evidence that it has something to say, at least. Now, just how much, that's what we need to discuss. But we should stop discussing if it has something to say. We should start talking more about how we can reduce the amount of ultra-processed foods that people are subjected to. And it cannot be something that the individual should handle on its own. You have 5-year-olds that are severely obese. Of course, it's not their responsibility. We need to do something with the food environment, and that goes into society as a whole. I'm not saying that all we need is the government or regulations to be put in place. There could be other ways as well to make the food environment be better. But as for now, I think that the major thing to do is to have rules and regulations for what kind of foods we produce, or how it is presented in food stores, and so that at least the younger part of the population are not subjected to this food environment that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, you are completely right. And I think the first step is to raise awareness and to bring these other topics to the discussion, and start focusing only on the macronutrient content and the calorie content of the foods, because there are definitely other dimensions that need to be considered. So when we were talking offline, you mentioned that your research has been moving to aging. So how was that process, and how does your current research connect to this type of research you were doing in the past?
Oh, a very good question. I was just pondering that this morning. And one connection is, when you're aging, also the microbiome changes. And there's not that much knowledge. If you transplant, say, a young microbiome to older people or older animals, what happens then? As far as I can see, there isn't really that much research to show that will actually rejuvenate the animal receiving a younger microbiome. But the point is that there's also connections there in the microbiome, and maybe now I can't remember all the research that I've read, but if you eat an ultra processed diet, if you get obese, if you have these ailments, that will increase aging. So for me, that it's still a very important topic that I follow closely. But my way into looking at aging and was that I started getting courses on the fasting mimicking diet and things related to fasting and time restricted eating. And when you start talking about that and looking into that, you cannot avoid the subject of aging, because restricting food for periods and then eating more and restricting food or fasting, that will affect aging related mechanisms. So that opened up the field for me of aging. So which lots of other things as well, such as calorie restriction mimetics or fasting mimetics, and also medications, and also all kinds of technologies that are being developed that have to do with aging and trying to slow the rates of aging. So it's not just about diet; it's about all things that have to do with an intermittent way of living, and also medications and other therapies.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Actually, in this podcast, we had the opportunity of talking with Dr. Walter Longo, who is well into research about fasting mimicking diets. And he mentioned different aspects, but the benefits that it brings with it, some of them mediated by the microbiome. And as you mentioned, the restriction, one thing that is true is that the longevity is associated with the lower calorie intake, right?
Yeah, but it's also a complex picture there because in some animals you can restrict the calories and they will not live longer, or even in different strains of mice. But in other, they will live longer. And one interesting aspect there, and also of relevance for humans, because it can be really hard to reduce your calorie intake every day throughout your life with 10% or 20% or more. And we don't really know if that's actually going to be beneficial to longevity, to what kind of health you're going to have, and then how long you're going to live. But what appears clear is that when you have these breaks from eating, and that you go on and off, that you do fasting, and then you eat as much as you want, and then you do fasting, that has an independent effect as well. And one really interesting study that came out, I think it was Acosta Rodriguez or something in 2022, which gave mice food at the wrong times. So just before the mice went to bed, so to say, or because they're mostly active during nighttime. And then another group of mice, they got food, before they were supposed to be active or in the morning. And that gave, I can't remember the exact percentage, but in terms of, just having the exact same time of fasting, the animals that got the food at the right time, they lived something like 10% longer. So that's a huge effect just by when you're getting the food. But also fasting in itself, in that same experiment, increased lifespan as well. So there is something about, flipping these switches that have to do with aging-related mechanisms through or by the use of not eating and then eating again and going on off like that is related to aging. And when you see that an animal lives longer, it is almost always a sign of the health also being better. So, it's not about just living longer for the sake of living longer, but it's about having good health for as long as possible.
Exactly, and that's what we all know, to not only to live longer, but to live a healthy life until the last minute, ideally. And I appreciate all the research that you are doing. This connection you started with this microbiome aspect, and how you extended your research into aging, which is actually one of the most interesting topics that we have been dealing with in this podcast. Is really exciting to read all this research, and we are going to be on the lookout for the results of your research in the future, and I hope we can discuss it in a future moment as well. So I want to close by thanking you, Dr. Lindseth, for sharing your knowledge with us and your wisdom and your experience. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to be at your podcast, so thank you.
Thank you so much. And for our audience, the link to the paper is going to be found in the description of the video. And see you in the next episode.